Great, and we're live. And I'm with Elizabeth Ramirez right now for the breakout session exploring legal frameworks that should apply to our identity, like as humans, as people, and our most intimate personal data. So we've got one viewer so far and three. Okay, so I know there's people are just logging in now. Why don't we give them 2 or 3 minutes to log in? And a little something I'm going to do is screen share. Hold on, before I do that, let me make sure I know what I'm doing. Oh yeah. Competing legal frameworks. Boom. Oh yeah. Let's see. Okay. Make sure we're broadcasting. I think that we are. Yes, we are. Okay. Awesome. Okay, so I'm going to do a quick screen share so everybody knows what's going on, and then why don't we get started, Elizabeth, as soon as I'm done with that. So hopefully my screen is sharing. I think that it is. Won't you please join us on the agenda page for this IAP class just by clicking agenda at the top of our GitHub repo. That's right, Dave. This is what we're talking about. And then scroll down to the breakout group on competing legal frameworks for humanity, i.e. our digital identity in the data-driven age. If you click on that, you'll see we'll get the live stream at the top of the page, and then go ahead and provide your questions and comments and ideas in this embedded pigeonhole widget just underneath the live stream, and I'll keep track of that for Elizabeth as she leads us through this session, and kind of be the voice of the people as best as I can be. So with that, I just want to say how thrilled we are to have you back virtually, but in a very real way at the MIT Media Lab, and hacking the law along with us again, Elizabeth. So welcome home to a place you're always welcome. And thanks for bringing up this great way to look at the legal frameworks that should apply to our digital identity and our personal data. Is everything property? Is everything for sale? Are we for sale? Or is there a better way? What are the alternatives? So thank you, and take it away. Could you actually let people know a little bit about who you are? A little bit of introduction would be helpful, and then please talk us through the session, and I'll help. And I'll just be verbally letting you know from time to time as there's questions and comments, or if you want to pause from time to time and ask about questions and comments, that would be great, and just allow for like a 30-second to a minute lag for me to collect them. Sound good?
Sounds great.
Okay, thanks, Elizabeth. Your show.
Thanks, Daza, and thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be back. Obviously, a lot's happened since the last legal forum, and so we'll get into some of that. But as a reminder, I am a data privacy lawyer. I've been practicing on 3 different continents for nearly a decade now on data protection and privacy issues, focused very much on the intersection of those issues with emerging technologies. And for the last 3.5 to 4 years, very much focused on blockchain, distributed ledger technologies, artificial intelligence and machine learning. And now, of course, all of these issues around data protection and privacy are converging with those emerging technologies and their use and governance. So I've developed sort of this niche interest in the intersection of all of those things. And I think the Legal Forum at the Media Lab is the perfect place to explore this because, of course, it's bringing together the law and the technology in that really meaningful way. So it's a real pleasure to be here. At the moment, I am serving as Global Policy Counsel of an identity startup known as called Evernym, which is known for this vision of something called self-sovereign identity, which we can dive into a bit. But the first thing I wanted to talk about before we dive into the subject, which is competing legal frameworks for humanity in the data-driven age, is this notion, as you mentioned, of our identity and what is the connection between our identity and data. Because what's happening now is that often in a conversation around data, so whether it's a panel at a conference or an article about identity or a new blockchain project for identity management, the conversation quickly turns into a conversation about data without anyone ever really stepping back to articulate, why? Why do we go from talking about identity to talking about data? And we actually sort of lose sight of the identity conversation. So I think something important to understand is that, data is increasingly becoming a proxy for expressions of our identity, for expressions of who we are, what we do, what we think and feel, our preferences, the way we relate to ourselves and to the world around us, our commercial power and activity. So this digitization of everything, turning everything into data, into binary information, zeros and ones, is relevant to the identity conversation because we are doing more digitally. We are doing more connectedly, not just online, but offline, of course. So our offline or so-called real-world experiences are increasingly being turned into data as well, because everything now has this sort of smart capability with sensors attached, and everything that we do, both online and offline, is aggregating and collecting all of this data about us and creating all of these data points about how we live our lives and how we go about, every second of our day. So I think we're all aware of this increasing, digitization, the digitization of everything. And there's certainly been a lot of really high-profile works and research that have come about to explore this phenomenon. And some of these I recommended in the course page. So, two really notable books that have influenced my thinking on this topic recently are Victor Meyer-Schomburger's Reinventing Capitalism in the Age of Big Data. And the fundamental premise of that book is that we're replacing this idea of financial capitalism, of money-based capitalism that makes the world go round, with a notion of data capitalism, where data becomes this new capitalist mechanism, becomes the new driver for the global economy, and underpins all of our commercial interactions. Now, we want to unpack that, of course, in the context of these competing frameworks and the validity of that premise. But the fact of the phenomenon occurring is a little bit hard to deny. So that's the first work that frames my thinking on this. The second has just come out in the last week, is a book by Shoshana Zuboff called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. And The Age of Surveillance Capitalism is incredibly interesting. In fact, the subtitle is even more interesting. The subtitle is The Fight for a Human Future at the New Frontier of Power. And so what Shoshana Zuboff explores in this book is this idea that our human experience itself is becoming the raw material that's driving the commercialization and commercial exploitation of our experience by corporates, by firms that have actually distorted the free market mechanics that we rely upon to sort of protect our rights. So two very important books on this topic, as I said, that are framing my thinking, but both are really approaching things from either an economic, or commercial perspective, and we haven't seen a deep dive exploration of how do we respond to this phenomenon? How do we respond to these new economic commercial realities from a legal point of view? And should we respond from a legal point of view? And what should the relevant legal frameworks be? So that's really the heart of this session, is to think about, as we move into this digital future, as we ourselves, whether it's embedding actual sensors in our bodies or turning ourselves into sort of extended, enhanced individuals with AI capabilities and robotic features and perhaps smart limbs, as we're ourselves becoming data, up until the point that we are no longer human, right? And to the extent that there is a degree of humanity left in us, what should the correct framework be, legal framework be, around the data that the experience of being human is creating? So, that's the extremely high level overarching problem that we want to address. And really what I would like in this session, and unfortunately, Daz, I can't see how many participants we have at the moment, but as we go through this, I want to start thinking about the principles that are going to guide us in trying to develop a framework or a number of frameworks for addressing this issue from a legal perspective.
Okay, so I'm sorry about that. I just wanted to leave we've got like 3 concurrent sessions going on at the same time in this teeny tiny little room in the media lab. So come with me around the corner to here we go, to the Bitcoin vending machine. A cool hack from one of our cool students. Anyhow, viewing here, and we've got a little bit of Slack channel chatter and Telegram, which I'll look at in a moment, but it's on like a different device. So let's see what we have in the pigeonhole. Okay, here's one question. What if both property and human rights, what's it say? What if both property and human rights law applied to the same data at the same time, but create different requirements or legal results? How is this dealt with or managed? I think that makes sense. Does that question make sense to you?
I think so. And I think that, we're not necessarily driving in the direction of, there is one exclusive framework that will apply in all circumstances, under all circumstances, in all situations. I think one of the fundamentally different things about digital versions of real world experiences, or digital analogs, digital twins, if you will, is that data is highly contextual, it's highly dynamic, and really can't be evaluated or assessed in a vacuum. So, there are things, and this is true in the real world as well, right? So again, Dazzle, we've had the conversation example around, personal effects or belongings that, might have certain property rights that attach, but also have certain rights, Fourth Amendment protections or privacy rights that attach at the same time, but they apply in different ways and they don't preclude one or the other from being true. So I think part of the reason for this session is to raise awareness around what we lose, right, if we only go, for example, with a property-based approach. And the risk is that we lose, exactly to this question, fundamental rights, whether they're human rights, civil rights, constitutional rights, dignitary moral rights. We risk losing sight of all those other important rights that attach to things that may very well be property-like or even property. And what we see in the rhetoric, particularly from large corporates and commercial entities, when Mark Zuckerberg starts talking about, you own your data, we know there's a problem with that framework and that there's a catch, right? So what we're trying to avoid is this kind of overly simplistic thinking about data because of its nature, which is so amorphous and dynamic and contextual. So it's a really brilliant question. And I think one of the things we can work towards in this session is perhaps there's a guiding principle in there around, avoiding reductionism or, embracing complexity, or there must be some guiding principle to extract from, these things not being exclusive.
Yes. That's great. And so, so just to highlight some of that those reflections on the question at the end, having maybe some set of principles or guidelines that apply to this imperative is what I would call it of ensuring that we know that we can and that we must sometimes apply human rights legal frameworks to identity and personal data would include. Well, I like the word to avoid reductionism or binary thinking that it's one or the other, or a bright line test of under these three circumstances apply framework A, under those two circumstances apply, but rather iterate this a little bit, but something that's like proportional, that's responsive to the circumstances. We can talk about factors to consider, maybe give 2 or 3 clear examples at the extremes where one applies quite well or where the other applies quite well. But that idea of avoiding reduction as a highlight from your answer seems quite good for a principle. That reminded me of one thing. So we've got a bunch of comments, but I want to just take the chair's prerogative for a moment, or the moderator's prerogative, to say Mila and Brian and TMA and I, when we were thinking about your session, excuse me, last night, we're thinking what would be really helpful would be if there was sort of like a table or something like that, where we could start to maybe like one column is property law and another column is human rights frameworks, or maybe even another column is civil liberties kinds of things, like Bill of Rights in the United States or something like that, where and then one row, and then row by row by row, we start looking at different types of features, and universal, inalienable, and oh God, what was the third one? And stuff like that are properties of human rights, and then there's other properties and factors and elements, that sort of thing, that might fall in different columns and rows. So starting to hack out a table, we thought would be a nice project, or a nice kind of exercise that maybe we could start to explore. How does that sound to you? Does that actually risk the reductionism that we seek to avoid? Could it shed some light, or what do you think about this idea?
It's an interesting idea. So I've actually undertaken the exercise myself, and in part, for preparation of this session. And what I found was that, again, that it's useful to a limited extent. So I think it's useful in framing the thinking and forcing oneself to go through the exercise of comparing and contrasting. But as soon as you get into any sort of thought experiments to test, whatever you've baked into such a table or framework, things get really messy. That said, I think it's still valuable, and I'm happy to, take what I've started and circulate with this group after the session, and maybe we could crowdsource, some additional features and flesh out the table a bit more. So some of the dimensions, for example, that I would look at are, the source of the rights. So, is the source natural law? Is it norms of society? Where are the rights deriving from? You might look at the nature of the rights. Are they focused on, the economic or commercial features? Are they focused on, the dignitary and human nature of our existence? We might look at examples within those categories of where are those rights codified? Where do they live? If they're codified, do they require codification? We might look at, what recourse mechanisms there are if those rights are violated, or what the individual recourse, is in a situation like that. Mechanisms for changing or amending rights, or their nature. So there are definitely, useful ways to frame and select certain features to compare and contrast these frameworks. But again, I think the real heart of it comes in thinking through, actual thought experiments or applications of them in living environments.
Here. So I'd like to make a request of all of the people who are with us in the session, and especially those of you that have provided feedback. Could you please go back into the pigeonhole widget, scan through the feedback, and upvote the ones that you most want Elizabeth to address, There's some that I think are more interesting, but what really matters is about the point of view that Elizabeth already lectured on, and we've already seen the lecture in the flipped classroom. So now let's have a conversation. And here's the good news: is you can all talk at once. So you don't usually get to have that in physical space. So with that in mind, let me go take another look and see what's being upvoted. Okay, we've got some votes. So here's one. You refer to, quote, the experience of being human. I would be interested in your thoughts about what that is and how is it different from the experience, if we can put it that way, of being a machine. The experience of being human, can you extrapolate on that a little bit?
It's a great question. And I think it, deserves its own session, seminar, dissertation, really, because it's such a complex question. But that is one of the things that we are desperately trying to figure out right now. So you see a lot of efforts towards, a Magna Carta on AI, or these sort of global charters on defining what it means to be human, in this big data-driven digital ecosystem. And I think the starting point has been, let's start with the process of elimination, right? And let's remove all of the things that we know machines can do. Let's catalog all the functions that we know that AI is sophisticated enough to undertake at this stage, and work from sort of, a what's left mindset. What's left that we...
Who are the parties?
So, if we think about, logic and mathematics and logical reasoning and pattern recognition and observational or statistical methodologies, all those things, we know, we've demonstrated that AI can do all of those things. But if we think about, for example, I think it's called the OODA loop, in sort of military speak, where I think it's observe, orient, decide, and act, right? We've probably gotten to a stage where, machines are really good at sort of the orienting and observing and the pattern recognition, but not so good necessarily at deciding, because of things like the quality of the data, the quality of the algorithm, the contextual environment, the feedback mechanisms, the responsiveness. So there's that perspective. But then of course there's, the more philosophical questions around human autonomy and agency and free will, and of course all the things around emotional intelligence. And we've seen how, even the really sophisticated Sophias and other AI are perhaps lacking empathy, right? Or lacking some of the emotionally intelligent features that humans have come to develop and acquire. So I think when I talk about our human experience, that's something that I take from Shoshana Zuboff, is this idea of commercializing, our human experience. That's really an imperfect description, because what that's talking about is the experience that can be captured by data. And, your question makes a really great point that, there are going to be things that can't be captured by data. And the problem is that if we go with a data first framework, right, then we're crowding out some of those things that can't be captured by data. And that's the risk, because there might be really important rights that attach to the things that can't be digitized or turned into data.
Awesome. That was a great question. Now, see, I love the fact that some of these questions are not ones that would have occurred to me, but now once I see them, yeah, that's a good idea. And then to hear you reflect upon them is very enriching. So quick feedback. So far, I kind of like this breakout format and gathering questions. So let's go to one more. We actually have a sort of a kind of a winner with the most votes from Johnny Penn. What hope do we have of mounting a data governance paradigm founded in human rights, given the pressure from the capitalist side? Is there an integrated versus a piecemeal solution? So it's just a very real, practical kind of question.
Yeah, it's a good question. So from my point of view, the property, ownership commodification paradigm has a lot of momentum. And it has a lot of momentum because the firms, the sort of hierarchical firms, be it them corporations or any type of other organized means and access to capital, have really embraced this ownership model because I think they appreciate the benefits that they can extract from it. So I think momentum is in favor of a sort of property-based approach. That said, I think there is an elevated consciousness around this at the moment on the part of individuals, and conversations like the one we're having now, where there's a small but growing and vocal minority of us who are raising awareness around the risks with that approach. And I think there is a fear of, do we lose our humanity? And I think that, whether it's been well articulated or not, there is kind of an assumption that there is some value in retaining some degree of our humanity. So, my hope is that people having this conversation like ourselves, grow louder to counteract some of the surveillance capitalists, right? Because if you put together, again, the two theories that I mentioned, the two books that I mentioned, if you look at Victor Meyer-Schonberger's book on reinventing capitalism, what he says is that a sort of free-for-all around data capitalism does not enhance, anyone's rights really, because it distorts market forces. So you end up, through the feedback effect and the power law and the law of networks, you end up with a situation of, the concentration of power in a handful of firms. And, Scott Galloway always makes this point around GAFA. So you actually don't end up with a free marketplace for the expression of individual rights and meaningful benefits accruing to individuals. You end up with a really distorted situation. So even for the sort of data capitalists that think that there is positive value in the commercialization of our data, there are some fundamental assumptions around preserving sort of the dynamics of a truly free marketplace where individuals can meaningfully participate. So even those, so I think there is room to engage on, on the terms of all of these frameworks. If we focus on our collective interest in retaining that shred of humanity. And that may be a very unsatisfying answer. But, I think there is a real risk right now of sight of rights. So I do think that for any of us who think there's any merit to competing frameworks, I would encourage folks to really challenge the surveillance capitalists vocally and aggressively.
Okay, here. And so that actually kind of brings us to, I think, the next question. Nicholas observes that there's differences in legislation enforcement at the international level. What is the international relations, and I would probably say international law, dimension of the relevant problem the problem that you're presenting about the application of a human rights and civil liberties legal framework to identity? This is something you're particularly well situated to speak to, I think.
Yeah, I mean, there's the sort of, legislative history, if you will, of, international law. There is the, century-old body of international law around human rights. So even before World War II, but really the first meaningful stake in the ground in Article 12 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights around, freedom from arbitrary interference with privacy, family, home, and correspondence. And that was obviously motivated by some of the atrocities of World War II and this the unified sense amongst the international community that there were real fundamental rights that attach to all of us universally, that again, even though they adhere to our person because they're an extension of our humanity, the international community felt that it was kind of worth putting a stake in the ground and codifying this in the form of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And then you see sort of reiteration decade after decade. So another meaningful evolutionary step in 1976 with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which I know, Daza, you have great interest in right now, because we're kind of at a point where we're taking comment on the extent to which member states have actually complied with their obligations under the ICCPR. So we can get into that a bit. But again, this is this idea of freedom from arbitrary interference with our privacy, and the same things that are codified, in, for example, in the U.S. Constitution, but on an international scale. So there's sort of broad agreement around what privacy might look like. We certainly don't have, it's really interesting to look at it from a comparative law perspective or international law perspective. I'm not aware of international legal covenants or agreements around, identity, because I don't think there's any single understanding or consensus around, what that even means. And so, actually this idea that we use proxies for identity isn't so new, right? It might be new in the way it's expressed as our digital identity or through data. But if you look at the evolution and genesis of international law around privacy from a human rights point of view, the reason that these things are, called out in these frameworks around home and family and effects and correspondence is because they're deemed to be expressions of who we are. They're deemed to be extensions of our identity or humanity. So those are kind of the foundational pieces in international law. Daz, I see you shaking agreement.
I just, every time your mouse is speaking, I find myself like just saying yes, yes, yes. I wish I had a better understanding of international law and kind of what's happening in the rest of the world outside the United States with respect to law generally, but especially legal frameworks that apply to this essential aspect of online life and online, online activities, which is identity and the reasonable expectations and frameworks of rules that apply to the use of identity and the rights and the obligations for identity. Part of the reason I was shaking my head so aggressively there, and I forgot that I was off mute, video mute, was because I was just thinking, in the physical world, we've got a lot of context that tells us a lot of information about what rules to apply. Like for just a simple example is you go to someone's house and you mention papers and effects, and that gets me into a Fourth Amendment kind of mindset where there's one aspect and kind of set of frameworks for managing our persons and our identity and our personal data, in the form of stuff we have on our body. So you go to someone's house, you're on the sidewalk, and you're kind of on the public street looking at their house. There's very little, sense of access or authorization to know much about that person that isn't very much public facing. Now you come and you're talking to them. They open the door, and you're sort of like maybe just inside their foyer, just inside their door, having a conversation. There's a little bit more. Now that you've been invited inside a threshold. You from a property perspective have hold on one second. Hey, Johnny. Oh, sorry. There's somebody I wanted to bring into the conversation. You've got, if you were like slip and fall, for example, there may be some responsibility for that person inside of your house. They have a certain kind of, there's certain expectations that if they see stuff in their house, they have a right to know that in your foyer, but there's not much there. It's kind of a quasi-public space almost. They come back into the kitchen and the living room. It's a little bit deeper. you go right back to like the bedroom, where you may have like much more personal things there, and people kind of know from the context, what to expect and how to behave. And so, like, we know when it's our home, and people know when you're in someone else's home. And that's from centuries and millennia of socialization and development of these underlying frameworks, which are reflected in law, but fundamentally come from, much deeper social layer, I think. But all that is just totally blown up in cyberspace. We've got such little information about whose location are we in, what kind of location. Is this commercial? Oh, good. Is this commercial, or is this pull up a chair? You can just throw stuff on the ground or something. Is this commercial, or is this residential? Is this industrial? Is it educational? Is it a public space? Is it a government space? I don't know. We know very little, and sometimes that's confusing because the user interface design, sometimes it's deliberately obfuscated, and so when I now try to think about the context of just what kind of culture applies here. Is it a European culture? Is it an Asian culture? What Asian culture? In such there's such thing as a European culture, or an Asian culture, or American. Well, United States, Massachusetts, or Texas. And so I just would love to know how to do a better job of knowing what context we're in, and which underlying frameworks of human rights, or property law for that matter, would even apply in the first place, before we even get to which one should apply. But leaving that aside, I have a treat for you, Elizabeth, a very special treat. It has a name and an identity. This is Johnny. Johnny, this is Elizabeth, and I wanted you two to meet for a while. And Johnny is leading a session that we're going to actually postpone and do after the class, on an adjacent topic related to basically workers in this case an employment environment, and rights with respect to data, identity, personal data, expectations that could have a major impact on your life opportunities, and your livelihood. And so, oh, Johnny, let me give you a little room here. And so I just wanted to allow Johnny to ask, or to first of all express, how does this question of human rights versus property rights show up in the big world of labor and work, and how would it show up if I was now in, whether the United States or Europe or somewhere, but I'm now at my workplace. And when I was in the 90s, when I was practicing law and had to deal with an organization that had tens of thousands of workers, and some things that came up was that they have a mobile phone now. That was new, believe it or not, once upon a time, and they're doing some conversations. Is that private? I mean, they're not using the work phone, but they're sitting in the work desk. And then they have lockers, but the lockers maybe don't have locks. Can we look in their locker if we were wondering if that's where the stapler is or something? Can we inspect their locker if we're wondering if they're stealing stuff? And then can we look at the top of their desk? Can we open a drawer? Can we strip search people when they're at work? Just what are the expectations in a work environment? And now what are the major implications now that so much of our stuff and our identity exists online? It's not even a physical drawer. So, I mean, can you just say a few words on how does this kind of question of privacy and liberties and rights show up in this world of work? And what are the big issues with respect to from the labor perspective going forward?
Can you hear me if I speak from here?
Yeah.
Should I put this on? Okay. I can just say briefly that you see this with professional athletes, I think, initially, because their data is really valuable. And so it's being harvested to make a lot of money. Currently, right now in the NFL, every player has a little chip on their shoulder, literally a chip on their shoulder that all the teams have access to when they're choosing who to keep and trade, et cetera. The players don't currently, A, get access to the data, or B, get paid for the value that data is generating. So there was a contract for $10 billion or $1 million in hotel in Las Vegas that was using this to kind of place bets about who's going to skate the fastest on a hockey game. Or something like that. I hope I'm not repeating your research in mentioning this. I can't remember who
At least it's new to what Elizabeth has said so far.
Okay. Uni Global Union is a federation of 650 unions around the world, private sector trade unions that I've been working with, helping them think through how they can use, how they can represent workers' interests in this. I think the core immediate challenges are about surveillance, that you know, if you lose your job because of something that's been revealed about your activity at work that you feel is totally unethical, that becomes a very difficult case to fight if your employer also owns that data. And then, as I mentioned to, or kind of alluded to, the professional athletes, the value of it, that's an open question too. If you're a Uber driver in New York City and the data that you are helping, the data set you're helping build around traffic patterns is sold for millions of dollars to the city, do you get access to that money? Not currently. The point is just, I guess, that some of the stuff that I think we'll face around identity, the really interesting questions you talked about today, Elizabeth, I think are hitting workers first. And that's one reason I've been trying to engage with that community.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. I think it goes to what Dazzle was just saying about, you know, you arrive at someone's house and you've got, like you said, you're on their property outside and you're progressively, you know, growing closer to the core. And it's the same idea that this digital creep, right, has blurred all these boundaries where there's no longer any separation between, you know, personal, professional, employment or non-employment context, online or offline. You have this blurring of everything, this convergence, and all these lanes breaking down, and the digital is laying claim to all of it, right? But that can't be valid, because then there's no space left for us to be ourselves, right? There's no space left. It completely crowds out any kind of autonomy or freedom of interference, right? It's really this notion of, like, where is that space? If the digital is everywhere, if everything is data, you know, where is that sort of freedom to be ourselves? And I don't think it's something that we should turn over. I think it's critical to, again, this conversation around what's left of humanity. I think we need a place that is not censored, right? And this movement, one of the things that I worry about a lot in the blockchain space that I've been spending the last 3.5 to 4 years in, is this drive towards, we want everything to be transparent and immutable and censorship resistant. But actually, what does that do to what does it do to us? It makes us censor ourselves, right? It makes us worry about every transaction, every activity, and we're no longer ourselves, right? We're completely subject to manipulation. So I think it's true in the employment context, and obviously in the U.S., employees have always had more limited rights than they've had in a lot of other jurisdictions. And again, that's in part because of what is the legal framework that we're applying. And in the U.S., we're often applying this sort of property, this commercially led framework around, well, the employer, owns you and owns your work, works for hire, right? Owns the products and efforts of your labor. Whereas in other jurisdictions, like in Europe, you don't lose, fundamental rights, human rights, privacy rights in the context of the employment relationship. So I think it is that, that convergence of everything as data that's challenging these legal frameworks. And I think that's one of the problems around these data-specific regulations, is that we have, for example, even with the GDPR, which I think has been extremely useful in elevating this conversation and elevating our consciousness around it, data-specific regulations kind of fall flat because they ignore these other aspects of our, you can't regulate data as data. Data takes on different significance and meaning, in different contexts to different people. So even this idea of trying to demarcate, this trend right now is, I've seen a lot of draft legislation in the US for a privacy bill. And a lot of the common features are they'll try and draw a line between, sensitive and non-sensitive data, right? Well, what does that mean? I don't think there's any way to pre-stipulate, what's sensitive and what's not sensitive. We use very antiquated, backward-looking notions around social security number, which is public and on the dark web anyway, right? Or these things. Whereas, for example, when we had the Target data breach a few years ago, and Target was, identifying pregnant women before their families knew they were pregnant, right? On the basis of their ordinary commercial purchases, the lotion they were buying, or, that wouldn't be classified as sensitive data. And yet it was highly revealing of very intimate details of their lives and personal information. So there's a lot of red herrings around there around, data specific regulations and how we treat data. And, I think most of them really fall short because they're losing sight of these aspects. So the employment context, it certainly highlights some of the issues, but it's really just this, the breaking down of all of these boundaries, right? They don't exist anymore. So it's a really interesting point.
So yeah, so
You gonna follow up?
what do you think will
No.
not?
Okay.
What do you think will happen? But what
I have a follow-up, please. So
going forward.
what is could we just take 1 second on what is identity to start with? So I'm pretty comfortable with stuff. So I have my diary is like that's always my go-to example. It's like, it's kind of a piece of property. It's encapsulated like in some expressed as bits or on paper, but it's somewhere I can find it and kind of I can delete it. It's got it's encapsulated. But what's the identity part of this equation? And is it the same as just a bucket of data that's really personal, or is there something essential about an object or an essence of something that is our identity, or it is us, literally is us, and to which things like, I don't know, the prohibition against slavery would apply versus the prohibition against theft of property. I know there's a lot of blurry lines there because slaves are deemed property, but there's also some distinctions between objects and live people. And I'm just wondering, what's the live people part of this equation online? Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I've got a lot of thoughts on that. So if you take Shoshana Zuboff's Surveillance Capitalism and you take it to its full dystopian expression, right? And we fully submit to that kind of world order. There's still going to be, and we're subject to all kinds of manipulation. All the data in real time is affecting all of our behavior and engineering all of our decisions and all of our activities. And yet, there probably, as individuals, we're going to have different responses. So some of us might be more resistant to that, even though we're making the same decisions outwardly. We might be, we might harbor kind of anger or different sentiments towards it. Our attitudes towards the same activities and the same behavior generating the same data might be different. I think there are still, I don't think you can, I think the whole point of identity, right? And as much as the term self-sovereign identity is like Marmite and divides a lot of people, I think the real value in it is that, I am the only one who can determine, what that means. And so the best that I think law and regulation can do is preserve space, hold space for someone to be someone, right? For a person to be themselves or an identity to express itself. And I don't think any law or regulation should seek to define what identity is. And again, going back to this, sensitive versus non-sensitive, I'm the only one who can determine, and actually in reality, if we were really aware of what's going on, all data would be sensitive data, right? Because I have no control over the myriad unforeseeable uses that these firms are going to make of it with their, their high-tech tools and their algorithms and their asymmetric power. So it has to be driven by the individual, by their own selves to be meaningfully identity in kind of a self-sovereign point of view.
Can I ask you a follow-up about that? So, Jonathan Zittrain at Harvard Law School has made a similar argument, I think, about like all data is personal data, because I think of it as like a wave of inference, that they're just in a world in which we have ubiquitous kind of surveillance technology, we can find out like the unusual cases are just going to grow and grow and grow the way we find each other or find out things about each other. I guess my first question is, what do you see as a kind of, I'll ask the boldest version of the question is, do you think that the law as an iterative measure is going to be able to keep up with the sort of challenges that this poses? Or do you think in sci-fi land we might need some sort of paradigmic change? I don't know what that would look like. I've never even really thought about it until right now, but I can maybe gesture in the direction of something, which is a second question. what do you think about the balance between individual and collective rights? Knowing that, yeah, I guess in this world.
Yeah, it's a really great question. I'll start with the second one because it's easier. So I think that technology is driving us to be more atomic, and it's hyper-focused on the individual right now. And I think commercial, hierarchical firms are really exploiting that atomic sort of individualistic view because it increases the information and the power asymmetry. And as much as there's an aversion, obviously, especially amongst Americans, to any kind of collectivist approach, I think if we focus on what we're actually trying to achieve, if we're actually trying to achieve more human autonomy and freedom of expression and identity expression, all these things, we might have to rethink the means to get there. Because I think this highly individualistic focus is part of why we've lost so many individual rights. I think similar to what's happened in the self-help sector, right? Of it's all on you, it's all on the individual. There are no structural problems, right? There's nothing that you are solely in control. Well, that's not true, right? If you've got this entire world order built around surveillance capitalism, it doesn't really matter how much what you do as an individual. You go completely off the grid to your own detriment, and still data inferences can be made about you. Or proxies or digital twins are built for you. I think we have to just stop being in denial around the fact that achieving individual ends and empowering individuals might require a more collectivist approach. That was your second question. Is there a follow-up to that?
Well, another way to phrase the first question, which is connected to the second question, is historically, you mentioned that the example you gave around, what was it? The kind of, not paradigm changes, but significant change in law emerging in response to kind of societal trauma. So during World War II, we have in response, new conceptions. Short of the sort of traumas, I guess my intuition says because the harms that we deal with these are often seemingly minute and distributed and difficult to characterize legally as true harms, to my understanding. I'm not a lawyer. It is probably, anticipating a really traumatic event. Short of that, there's a fire alarm here. You take over so people don't have to listen to this.
Yeah, okay, if you want to go on mute. So I think I know what you're getting at, and I hope you can evacuate if you need to. So for me, I'm a minimalist about most everything, and I would extend that to the law. And I think that, again, there's a lot of drive right now. You guys okay? Everything?
Hey, I don't know if you can hear this emergency alert, but apparently there's been an emergency in the media lab, and we're all supposed to scramble out the chute or something. So unfortunately, we have to terminate the broadcast a little bit early. I'm so sorry.
We're all due.
Thank you, Elizabeth. We're much obliged. Watch Telegram, and we'll do a report out from your group, and we'll keep you posted.
Okay, thank you guys. Be safe.
Thanks. You too. Bye.
All disabled occupants shall follow the